Welcome, Gunrunner.
2 months ago I produced a video looking at cancelled console expansions, which proved to be very popular with my audience. So it was inevitable that a follow-up video would follow at some point, and here we are. But this time around we won't be looking at more cancelled console expansions, instead we'll be looking at 5 that probably should have been cancelled due to how badly they failed in the market. As I said in the previous video, console expansions have a pretty shaky history. Even ones that did manage to make it into the mainstream never really succeeded like their manufacturers hoped. For example, the PC Engine Super CD's lack of Western penetration, or the fairly low attach rate of the Sega Mega CD for a console that was leading the market at that time. But in this video we aren't going to be looking at those, or even expansions that did well in specific regions like the Famicom Disk System or ColecoVision expansion module. These were expansions that came with really high hopes, but failed so hard they were gone within a year or so of their debuts. Just to make things more interesting, I've also listed these in chronological order, so this video also serves as a historical timeline of failure as well as an education in ineptitude. So with this intro out the way, it's time to get on with the show as I proudly present the story of 5 failed console expansions.
Last year, this Atari. Now the kid wants a computer. Better idea. The supercharger from StarPath. Don't cost much. Plug it in the Atari and play supercharger computer games that cost under 15 bucks each. And the supercharger comes with this phaser patrol game. Rocket stuff. And the kid can fight those commie mutants from space. 'Cause they're out there. Give your kid a...
Available at fine stores everywhere.
From almost the moment the first genuine contenders to the Atari 2600 hit the market, people started to think about ways they could try and expand the console to keep up with the competition. This included both Atari and various third parties. Indeed, I covered one of these, the Mattel Supercharger module, in the aforementioned cancelled console expansions video. But with this first entry on the list, we look at another unit with a very similar name that did make it to market, the StarPath Supercharger, or Arcadia Supercharger as it was originally known. And let's start on that name change actually, because that's an interesting story in itself. You may be aware that when the Arcadia Supercharger first hit the market in August 1982, there was another console on the market that shared a very similar name in the form of the Emerson Arcadia 2001. There were not only concerns over the similarity in the company name to this new console, but also potential lawsuits for trademark infringement, so the company came up with a new name in StarPath. The design for the Supercharger was actually supposed to achieve 2 different things: expanding the stock hardware of the Atari 2600 and reducing the cost of its games. And the second part of this is particularly interesting, because the storage medium for the Supercharger was actually regular cassette tapes. The device itself plugged into the 2600's cartridge port and added 6K of RAM, a big upgrade on the existing 128 bytes, as well as a cable coming out the side to connect it to the headphone jack of any regular tape deck. Though the only real hardware upgrade was the extra memory, this on its own opened the opportunity to deliver far more advanced graphics than seen in regular cartridge games of the time. This was made most obvious by the alternative port of Frogger that was released for the Supercharger, which came about because the rights for ROM cartridges and magnetic media had been sold separately by Sega. This has far better visuals than the already impressive port released by Parker Brothers. There were 12 games released in total for the Supercharger, with 2 more in the prototype phase when StarPath went under. The timing of the Supercharger's release was very unfortunate in actual fact, coming about just before the great North American video game crash hit, which stopped it from getting the success it really deserved. However, there is a somewhat happy ending to this story, because after StarPath declared bankruptcy, the company was taken over by Epix, who were looking to expand into making more arcade-like games. This brought them the core of the team that went on to create the famous Games series, and indeed one of those cancelled Supercharger games, in Sweat, was evolved further to create the best-selling summer games, the first in that series. As we all know, the first genuine rival to the market-leading Atari 2600 was Mattel's much more advanced Intellivision. From the moment they started advertising the console in 1979, Mattel Electronics promised the ability to convert the Intellivision into a fully blown home computer by adding the keyboard component to your existing master component, and it's been said that many consoles were sold on the back of that very promise. Unfortunately, things didn't go quite as Mattel planned. Referred to internally as both the Blue Whale and the Intelliputer, the planned keyboard component would have offered 16 kilobytes of fully expandable RAM, built-in cassette storage for programs and data, an optional 40-column thermal printer, and a secondary CPU to run all of these expanded features independently of the Intellivision's CP1610 processor. Sounds a bit like the Coleco Adam add-on, doesn't it? This unit was aimed purely at parents emptying their pockets rather than the kids playing the Intellivision, as a range of business, productivity and educational software was promised as part of the initial lineup for the keyboard component, as well as a selection of more advanced games. However, it soon became clear to Mattel that the IKC was far too ambitious for its own good and was going to cost far too much to produce. They also discovered a number of bugs and reliability issues that stopped it working as intended. David, Papa Intellivision Chandler, and the rest of his engineering group kept going back to the drawing board time after time, trying to find ways to overcome these problems without success, so Mattel took the decision to cut their losses and quietly cancel it. But the people who bought an Intellivision based on the promise of a home computer upgrade were becoming very disgruntled and complained to the Federal Trade Commission, aka the FTC, who launched an investigation into Mattel Electronics for fraud and false advertising. Mattel claimed that the keyboard component was a real product that was still being test marketed, and they even released a small number of keyboard components and a handful of software titles to a select few retail stores, as well as offering them via mail order to any customers who complained loudly enough in order to help support this claim. This didn't really seem to satisfy the FTC though, so Mattel decided to put a proposed Plan B into action. This came from a second group within Mattel Electronics led by Richard Chang, who had already been designing a simple computer to introduce children to basic programming. But on the side, they had also been asked to find solutions to the Intellivision keyboard component too. Their idea was something called Lucky, standing for Low User Cost Keyboard Interface, which downgraded the original specifications greatly. This new unit would have just 2K of RAM, no secondary CPU, and the option of a cassette interface, rather than this being standard. It wasn't all bad though, as it also included a built-in BASIC, if a rather rubbish version of it, 2 extra control ports, and added a second AY3 8910 sound chip, which expanded the system's audio capabilities, 6 voice synthesized sound, and could be paired with an optional 49 key music synthesizer keyboard. It wasn't what was promised by Mattel, but it fulfilled the obligation to provide a computer add-on for the Intellivision, which was ultimately enough to keep the FTC happy. Mattel finally unveiled their computer add-on, now renamed the Entertainment Computer System, or ECS, in the last quarter of 1982. This wasn't the end of their woes with this project, as they had to buy back all of the existing keyboard components from retailers and were then also hit with a lawsuit by the manufacturer contracted to make the keyboard component, Compro Inc. They sued for $10 million in damages, claiming breach of contract, fraud and non-payment of the last 1,300 units. Mattel had no choice but to settle. This lawsuit caused yet more delays that meant the ECS missed the incredibly important 1982 Christmas season and wasn't formally shown to the public until the January 1983 Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. A few months later, the ECS finally hit the market along with a small lineup of games and other software, which was enough to get the FTC off their back and drop the $10,000 per day fines. By the time the ECS made its retail debut, the internal shake-up at the top of Mattel Electronics had caused the company to shift its focus away from hardware add-ons in favour of much more profitable software. So the ECS wasn't widely advertised, and a planned program expander that would have added another 16 kilobytes of RAM and a more sophisticated fully featured extended BASIC to the system was cancelled. In the end, only half a dozen titles were released for the ECS, and the project proved to be a huge loss maker for Mattel. I'd bet that the very mention of a failed console expansion brought images of Sega's failed mushroom-like add-on to mind. It's undoubtedly the most famous and high profile example of this video's very subject, and a story that I'm sure pretty much everyone out there is more than familiar with, so I won't go into great levels of detail on this one. I think many would point to the 32X as the start of the once great company's downfall, a device that only came about because of the almost endless bickering between Sega of America and their Japanese parent company Sega Enterprises. This bad feeling was reportedly born out of jealousy, as the Sega Mega Drive had failed in Japan whilst being hugely successful in North America. Apparently Sega America also used to bring this point up constantly in discussions about the company's future to try and gain extra leverage in the decision making process, which further put noises out of joint in Japan. And this bit of backstory is very important because it directly relates to how the 32X add-on came out. You see, over in Japan, Sega was so upset about the failure of the Mega Drive that they just wanted to move on and saw the Saturn as their future. Whilst over in America, Tom Kalinske and his team were still riding high on success and felt that the Sega Genesis was far from dead, so we're looking at ways to prolong the life of the console. Word has it they were also scared about the impending release of the Atari Jaguar, feeling it had the potential to take the market by storm and take away Sega's huge piece of the pie before the Saturn had even landed. So a 32-bit expansion for the Sega Genesis would not only prolong the life of the console, but also rival any other new consoles coming onto the market. Instead of the Saturn, they also wanted to release a new standalone console called the Neptune that would combine the 32X and Genesis into one very sleek looking unit. The 32X would feature not one but two Hitachi SH2 RISC processors, a bit like the Saturn in many regards, that would be capable of delivering over 32,000 colours and 50,000 polygons a second. It also added 512k of extra RAM, split between main RAM and video RAM to help deliver this performance, and could also be linked to the Sega Mega CD for even more advantages, including much more capable full motion video. Released a year later than the console it was targeting, the Jaguar, in November 1994, Sega supported the 32X along with a big advertising campaign, as well as delivering a host of big name titles, including ports of hit arcade games like Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing and Star Wars Arcade. But they struggled to get third parties to sign up. They were happy to sit back and see how the market played out, with all these new machines like the PlayStation and Sega's own Saturn on the horizon. And consumers very much seemed to feel the same way, happy to stick with the 16-bit consoles until they were given a really good reason to upgrade to the next generation. Despite huge interest in the add-on, in January 1995, just over a year after launch, it was reported that Sega had sold just 600,000 32X units, with all but 100,000 of these in North America. The Saturn was due for release within the next few months, and it had become clear that the argument for the release of the Neptune was no longer feasible, with the cost of the hardware being so close to the proposed retail price of the more powerful Saturn. So the decision was made to discontinue the 32X, and within a matter of months they were retailing for less than $100, £60 less than their original RRP. Just 40 games were released for the 32X, with 6 of those also requiring a Mega CD add-on, and the device will be forever remembered for what it did to Sega as a company, rather than what it did to actually enhance the Genesis. Not long after Atari announced their revolutionary 64-bit Jaguar console, they quashed all the queries about why it was using cartridges instead of CDs by revealing that it would be joined by a CD add-on within a year of release, thus going down a similar route to the Sega Mega CD and NEC Super CD-ROM. This would give Jaguar users the best of both worlds, and allow Atari to refine the new technology and make relevant upgrades in the meantime. The initial specs for the Jaguar CD suggested that it would offer only a few basic upgrades over the existing Jaguar hardware, in the form of additional storage, CD audio and full motion video, along with the option of adding an MPEG cartridge for video CD compatibility. But then Atari announced that the CD add-on had been delayed until 1995. There were lots of different stories flying about that explained why, such as the new games not being ready, Atari wanted to build a bigger user base for the console itself, and most interestingly, a need to revise the hardware to enable the Jaguar to better compete with the upcoming Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. But then 1995 came around and the Jaguar CD was ready for release, along with the first stream of new CD-based games. The much rumoured hardware upgrades were nowhere to be seen, and the specs of the unit were identical to what was initially announced after the Jaguar's debut. A lot of people criticised this decision, and the initial run of games was doing little to change people's minds. The Jaguar was already selling very poorly, and the Jaguar CD did little to change that, with both being discontinued the following year with only 15 releases in the CD format. To most people it seemed absolute madness to release such an add-on for an already failing console, but you have to realise that Atari were hoping that the Jaguar CD would reverse the console's fortunes. But given how badly Atari had already bungled the Jaguar itself, the Jaguar CD was very much doomed from the start. Much of the early CD software was lacklustre, with titles like Blue Lightning, Baldies and Primal Rage criticised for being on CD in the first place, but it's pretty clear they could have been played from cartridges just as well. Better in the case of Primal Rage in fact, with its horrendous loading times. Promised big name CD focused titles like Mortal Kombat 3, Black Ice, White Noise and Demolition Man never arrived, with around 90% of all announced Jaguar CD games being cancelled due to its failure in the market. What's particularly interesting about this is that the initial run of Jaguar CD units produced by Philips of just 25,000 units sold out almost immediately, and Atari had another 25,000 units on order. However, it's widely thought that the second run were never actually produced, and this is the reason why working Jaguar CD add-ons are now so rare and sought after. Almost as soon as Nintendo announced the then Ultra 64 console, there was one big question on everyone's lips. Why was it using cartridges instead of CDs? Compact discs has already become the default format for video games with the emergence of the PC CD-ROM as the dominant computer platform, and of course the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, the then market leaders in the console industry. Indeed, another cartridge-based 64-bit console had already failed in the form of the Atari Jaguar, with its own aforementioned attempt to rectify that mistake in the form of the Jaguar CD add-on, failing even harder. So why did Nintendo think that this was a good idea? Well, Nintendo soon aimed to calm people's concerns in a series of magazine interviews where they claimed that a CD add-on for the Ultra 64 would be released in due course. But almost as soon as the newly renamed Nintendo 64 console hit the market, all the chatter about the CD add-on went quiet, and stayed that way, with Nintendo staying pretty tight-lipped on the subject. Then in 1999, 3 years after the console's launch, Nintendo finally made an announcement regarding a disc-based add-on for their newest console. But rather than utilising CDs, they would return to another dying medium, floppy disks, and people were rightly baffled by the move. Called the Nintendo 64 Dynamic Drive, or N64DD for short, it would plug into the extension port on the other side of the console and enable it to use proprietary 64MB magnetic discs for expanded and rewritable data storage, as well as featuring a real-time clock, font and audio library for further storage efficiency, and a modem for online play and various other services. Describing it as the first writable bulk data storage device for a modern video game console, Nintendo very much painted the 64DD as some sort of revolution that would introduce new types of advanced games that had never been seen before. It was launched in Japan in December 1999, with Western releases to follow. However, as history tells us, that never happened, because the N64DD was far from what was promised by Nintendo and was riddled with issues that must have left Sony rubbing their hands in delight. Firstly, there was the limited storage capacity of just 64MB per disc compared to around 700MB for a CD. There was also the increased unreliability of magnetic media, and finally the proprietary format of disc that Nintendo used, which would also be more expensive to produce than a CD, discouraging third-party developers, just as the use of cartridges had done before it. Nintendo announced that they had produced 500,000 N64DD units and expected the takeout to be high, but sales were almost non-existent, with only 15,000 users signing up for the online service, and the Western release completely cancelled. The add-on was discontinued just over a year after its release, and despite there being over 60 games announced for the N64DD, just 9, yes 9, were released. 4 of which were Mario Artist productivity packages, making things even worse. This absolutely dismal failure in the marketplace means that the N64DD goes down as by far Nintendo's biggest failure.
こんな楽しいゲームができるのは 64DD ランドネットだけ。新作ソフトも続々。 64DD ランドネット、ただいま会員募集中。急げ。
And that runs up my look at 5 failed console expansions. Can you think of any other enhancement add-ons that failed in the marketplace, or did you actually own one of these back in the day and want to share your experiences? We also love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons who continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons and YouTube backers in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Grady Haynes, Mitchell Valentino, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Sonic Mania 999, Paul Daniel, Andrew McKay, Retro Resolution, Matt Standish, James Taylor, Trogdor the Burninator, Mins, A Bit Guy, Luke MC, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, Daniel Skoronsky, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.